Next, we'll talk about England's evolving government. So after William the Conqueror, the King of England owned all of England, but also owned part of what we would now call France. Back then, it was independent kingdoms and provinces. So the goal of English monarchs was to hold and add to the amount of French territory that they had. Next, they would try to strengthen control from nobles and the church. Henry II, who was a successor of William the Conqueror, married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a province in France. Through the marriage, Henry acquired all of Aquitaine, which made him a vassal or lord to the French king. So Henry was king of England and Normandy, which are his own independent. He has number one power there. But Aquitaine is owned by the French king. So in Aquitaine, Henry must answer to the French king. So this made things very, very interesting between the French king and the English king, because no king wants to have another king tell him what to do. Next, we'll talk about juries and common law. So Henry, from 1154 to 1189, one of the big things that he did was change the English court system. He took royal judges and had them go to every part of England at least once a year to hear cases and decide verdicts. These royal judges did more than just settle cases. They also collected taxes, settled lawsuits, and did like normal judges do, handed out punishment for crimes. Juries, a little bit different than we have juries today. So the person accused of a crime could call 12 neighbors to speak on his behalf. And they would answer questions asked by the royal judge. He would ask the people questions, and then he would then make his ruling. Common law. We would call common law today precedents. Basically what common law is, ruling of the courts over the years. So before a judge makes his ruling, he looks at rulings of other judges from similar cases over the years. For example, someone is caught stealing. He steals a loaf of bread from his neighbor next door. They look at other court rulings where someone has stolen something from someone else, similar case, and they look before they make their ruling, and they're going to dish out a punishment that would be similar to the other one. Okay, so it's common, it's happened before, and that's how they use their law system. Next, we'll talk about the Magna Carta. So Henry was succeeded by his son Richard. This is the same Richard the Lionheart that we have talked about from the Crusades and the Robin Hood myth. Well, Richard died, he had no heir. So his younger brother John came to power and ruled from 1199 to 1216. John failed as a military leader. John was very unsuccessful in France and lost a great chunk of lands to the French king. He lost all of Normandy and the northern lands in France. Because of his military failures and because of other rumors about his prowess, he was nicknamed Soft Sword. Think of a sword that just falls down to the side, doesn't stand up the way it's supposed to. And that's what his name was around court. He was not very well thought of. His inabilities as a ruler forced a conference with the nobles. Just like the Robin Hood myth says, he was very cruel and squeezed taxes out of the people. He also alienated the church and threatened to get rid of charters. So he's not making anybody happy. The church didn't like him because the way he treated them, and towns using their charters. It was how they would run their government in their small area, and they didn't like John getting involved with it. Here is a picture of the Magna Carta, which we will talk about soon. You can still go see it today in England. It is a historic document, however, it's not as historic as people might have you believe. People think the Magna Carta is the first time where people get their list of rights and it applied to everyone and so on and so forth. Not necessarily true. The Magna Carta only applied to nobles, number one, so only the rich. Number two, like all decrees and doctrines, when the new king came to power, all the old doctrines and decrees were nullified and made void. Besides that, as soon as John signed this, he burnt it, meaning he never intended on keeping any of them. So, was it the first time that somebody had tried to curb the power of a king? Yes. Did it really work? Was it effectual? Not really. So the nobles revolted because of all the things that were happening in England. And on June 5th, 1215, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which is the Great Charter. First, it applied only to nobles, then later on to all citizens. It did lay out basic political rights. It guaranteed the feudal rights of the nobles, and it said no taxation without representation. It allowed for a trial by jury and allowed for protection of the law. And as I said, first to the nobles, then to all citizens. It is revolutionary because it does lay the groundwork for future generations and documents to really carve out the rights of people and the fact that even the king is subject to the law. The model parliament. Next we'll talk about the model parliament. Edward I. He needed taxes to fight against the French, Welsh, and Scots. He kept with the same tradition of no taxation without representation. So he needed to have all new taxes approved. He didn't have to, but it would be a good idea for him to. As in, he's king, he can do what he wants. Without the backing of the nobles, it wouldn't be very helpful. So in 1295, he summoned 2 burgesses, which would be a citizen of wealth and property from every borough, and 2 knights from every county. And this would make up Parliament, the legislative group. The knights, burgesses, bishops, and lords met. Now it's nobles and lords. This would be this will be the House of Lords and eventually the House of Commons. At this point, Parliament was then called whenever a new tax was needed, and then this was moved to, as I said earlier, what we know as the House of Lords and House of Commons, and they each met separately. Originally, this helped the king weaken the power of the lords, because now in Parliament they are fighting against each other, not unified against the king. Eventually, the lords will figure out that if they work together in Parliament, they could curb the power of the king. Next, we're going to switch and talk about France and the Capetian dynasty that ruled there. So France, not like it is today. It was a feudal system that had 47 different territories. In 987, last member of the Carolingian family died. His name was Louis the Sluggard. I think he was really fast. Maybe. Hugh Capet was then made king. They picked Hugh Capet because he was weak. He didn't have a lot of political connections, didn't have an overwhelming amount of land or anything like that. The nobles knew that they could control him. For as weak as he was, he did do one thing that would have a lasting impact, and that was that he made Paris the capital of France. So here we have the Capetian monarchy. So this is all the land controlled by France, and the monarchy slightly different than what it is today. However, most of the lords in these areas had more power than the king himself. So France becomes a separate kingdom. France had a very strategic location because it was right around all the trade routes. You had harbors for ships, and you had people coming in over land routes. So it made France a nice hub for trade in all of Europe. For the next 200 years, the Capetian kings began tightening their control, consolidating power, and really getting the nobles underneath them. And it started in Paris and then spread from there. Philip II began expanding power. He ruled from 1180 to 1223. He watched his father lose to Henry II of England. So he became king at age 15, and he set out the goal to weaken English power. He was very crafty, yet he was also very unprincipled. He was not successful against Henry or Richard, but against John, he was. 1204, he was able to take Normandy, and then he took other territory in northern France. By the time he was done, he had tripled the land underneath his control. This was the first time that a French king had become more powerful than his vassals. And he wanted even more control over his nobles. And he's going to follow almost like an English system of law. He had royal officials that were called bailiffs. And just like in England, they were sent all over France. They presided over courts and also collected taxes. Philip's heirs. Louis IX ruled from 1226 to 1270. He was very pious and saintly, so a very holy and devout man. He was the ideal king, and he was made into a saint. He also created appeals courts, so if you didn't like the ruling, you could appeal it to a new court. and he strengthened the monarchy by weakening feudal ties. People became tied to him, not to their feudal lords. Philip V ruled from 1285 to 1314. During this time, the Pope forbade the clergy to pay taxes to the king. Philip disputed this. To do this, he would need support of the nobles, the clergy, and the commoners to go up against something big like the church. There is the pious king, and there is the not-so-pious king. The Estates General. So what he did is he called the estates together to dispute this tax. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate, great lords, the third estate, commoners, wealthy landowners, merchants, everyone else. At first, increased the power of the nobility, just like Parliament. They began squabbling with each other, not uniting against the king. Unlike in England, this never became an independent governing body. 100 Years' War and the Plague, a church divided. The Pope and the King collided. In 1300, Boniface VIII attempted to enforce papal authority on the kings, meaning the kings had to sit and do what he said. It had documents that said the kings must obey the Pope. King Philip of France disagreed and took the Pope prisoner in September of 1303. He planned to bring him to France for trial, but he was rescued, and then a month later the Pope died. After that, the Pope never reclaimed former power, realizing that if he tried to, the kings would take care of him. There's Pope Boniface there. Avignon and the Great Schism. In 1305, Philip persuaded the College of Cardinals to choose a French archbishop as Pope. He was Clement V. He moved papal authority from Rome to Avignon in France, and the Pope lived there for the next 69 years. This weakened the church. Many people did not like that the church moved its headquarters. They thought that its headquarters should be in Rome where it had always been. And reformers attempted to move the capital back to Rome, and it made matters even worse. There's the Pope right there. 1378, Pope Gregory XI died while visiting Rome. So he was still lived in Avignon, but he was visiting Rome, and he died. The College Cardinals met in Rome to choose a new successor. The mob outside cried for a Roman Pope, or at least an Italian Pope. So an Italian Pope, Urban VI, was elected. He was arrogant and had a passion for reform, which caused the Cardinals to not like him and elect a new Pope a few months later, Clement VII. Now you have two popes. Each declared the other a false pope and excommunicated the other. So you have a big, great schism, a rift in the church. You had one pope in Avignon and one in Rome. There's your one pope. There's your second. In 1414, the Council of Constance got together to fix the problem of having two popes. So they elected a new pope. Now there are three popes. One in Avignon, one in Rome, one in Pisa. Finally, the Holy Roman Emperor stepped in and the council, and they forced all three popes to resign. In 1417, a new pope, Martin V, was declared, and a very weakened papacy. People began to see this as a laughable office, as a bunch of idiots who didn't know how to get the job done. Hence, three popes. Scholars began to then challenge church authority. If the pope is wrong and they can have problems choosing the pope, why can't other things be wrong? John Wycliffe is one of the first. He said that Jesus, not the pope, was the head of the church. He was against worldliness, and the wealth of the clergy. He said the clergy should not have wealth or land, and that the Bible, not the Pope, was the final authority about Christian life. He also wanted an English translation of the Bible. There is a picture of Wycliffe. Jan Hus. Jan Hus said that the Bible was a higher authority than the Pope. He was excommunicated in 1412. In 1414, he was seized by the church. A year later, in 1415, he was burned as a heretic. Shortly after that, the bubonic plague was going to strike. In the 1300s, there was an epidemic that affected Asia, North Africa, and Europe, and it killed 1/3 of the world's population at the time. There's a picture of Jan Hus.